At the same moment, multiple great civilizations collapsed, and no one could fully explain why. And just before the collapse, they were the most powerful civilizations in world history. Civilizations connected to each other, dependent on each other. Then, something happened, and one by one, they all fell silent. In just 50 years, all their lights went out. Why at the same time? A single empire can collapse, that is normal. But if all of them collapse at once, this is not a collapse. This was a fire that started slowly but consumed everything. And the most terrifying part was that no one realized it had begun, until everything had already fallen apart. Now I'm going to take you back to just before 1200 BCE, to the peak of the Bronze Age. Because to understand every great collapse, you must first feel that greatness. The Mediterranean, a trade network beating like the heart of the world. Grain leaves Egypt, loaded onto ships. Copper comes from Cyprus, tin from thousands of kilometers away, and all of it comes together for one thing: bronze. This is not just a trade network. This is the survival mechanism of civilization. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses was corresponding with the Hittite king. They fought. They faced each other at Kadesh. But then, they made the first written peace treaty in history. The system was incredibly valuable, and that is exactly why it was fatally fragile. Fragility. But no one realized it. Have you ever heard of Ugarit, a lost city on the coast of modern-day Syria? But in the Bronze Age, Ugarit was one of the most important trade centers in the world. Caravans from the east reached the sea here. Ships from the west came ashore here. Tablets written in many languages accumulated in the city's archives. Ugarit was not just a city. Ugarit was the central node of the entire system. And the most critical points of a system are also its weakest. And now we arrive at the truly terrifying question. How can a world this powerful, this connected, this sophisticated, disappear? The answer was hidden within its own strength. Everything was connected. A disturbance that began in one place could spread everywhere. But no one saw this as a threat, because this connection looked like power. At least that's what they believed. Cyprus produces copper, but has no grain. Egypt produces grain, but has no metal. The Hittites cannot wage war without tin. Everyone has something. Everyone needs something. In times of peace, this dependency is wealth. In times of crisis, it becomes a deadly trap. And the crisis was already on its way. But no one understood that this was the beginning of a collapse. The first signs were silent, so silent that no one saw them as a threat. Drought began in the interior of Anatolia. 1 year, then another, then another. The rains did not come, rivers dried up, farmland cracked open, and this was the first domino. No one called it a systemic crisis. They called it the wrath of the gods. They called it bad luck. They thought it would pass. It didn't. Grain production declined. At first, a slight drop, almost unnoticeable. But in this system, even a small decline created massive shockwaves. Because grain was not just food. Grain was currency. Grain was power. Grain was the foundation of balance. And at that moment, the foundation of the system began to dissolve. And this is where everything changes. Because this was not a single disaster. This was a chain of disasters triggering each other. There was no single cause. That is why no one could stop it. For a long time, people searched for one reason. The sea peoples? Earthquakes? Drought? Everyone was looking for a single killer. But the truth was far more complex. This was not one disaster. This was a cascading collapse. Could it have been stopped? Most likely, no. As the drought began, people from rural areas started migrating to cities. This was the first fracture, a slow, invisible wave that rotted the system from within. The people arriving in cities could not find jobs. They could not find food. The cities could not support them because the cities themselves were struggling with drought. And then something began to unravel in western Anatolia. The balance of power between regions broke down. Small kingdoms weakened. Villages under their protection were left exposed. The unprotected people began to move. First a few individuals, then families, then entire communities. And these communities grew larger, more desperate, more dangerous. Historians call them the Sea Peoples. They were not a single people. They were the byproduct of a collapsing system. People who had lost their homes, who were starving, and who would do whatever it took to survive. And these people moved eastward. Return to Ugarit. Around 1185 BCE, the last ruler of Ugarit sent urgent requests for help to neighboring kingdoms. These letters survived to this day. "The enemy has come! Cities are burning. Everything is being destroyed." This was a record of a civilization's final moments. One tablet reads, "Enemy ships have been seen on our shores. Cities have been set on fire. Everything has been devastated." And then, something even worse came. The reply from Al-Ashia, Ugarit's neighbor. The king was told, "May the gods protect you," but no help came. Ugarit was burned, destroyed, and abandoned, forever. The city was never rebuilt, never resettled. It vanished from history and waited beneath the soil for 3,000 years. But Ugarit was not just a city, remember? It was a junction. And when the junction collapsed, all the roads connected to it stopped functioning. The dominoes had begun to fall. Copper stopped. Tin was cut off. Ship production collapsed. Bronze disappeared. Armies were left without weapons. The system began to collapse. And at that moment, even the greatest empires stopped. The Hittite Empire was the heart of Anatolia. For nearly 200 years, it had competed with Egypt for power. Two superpowers equal in weight. But around 1190 BCE, Hattusa, the capital, was burned. Who burned it? We don't know. But the city was destroyed, abandoned, and the Hittite state disappeared from history. A centuries-old empire, gone within a few decades. Then came the turn of Mycenae, the Bronze Age civilization of Greece. Magnificent palaces, powerful kings, a key player in Mediterranean trade. The Linear B script showed how this system functioned, but by 1100 BCE, Mycenaean palaces were in ruins. Linear B fell out of use, because the system that sustained it was gone, and Greece sank into darkness. A darkness that lasted 400 years. For 4 centuries, these communities wrote nothing. Writing disappeared. Records vanished. Cities shrank. People forgot their past. They turned their own history into myths, not to remember, but to understand. Because the truth was too vast, too dark. It could not be processed. What about Egypt? Egypt survived. Ramesses III repelled the attacks of the Sea Peoples. He achieved a great victory. At least, that's how he told it. He carved this victory into the walls of the Medinet Habu temple. Massive reliefs, battle scenes, captured enemies. But not everything carved in stone is true. Egypt emerged from these wars exhausted. Granaries were empty. The population had declined. The trade network had collapsed. It survived, but it was no longer the same Egypt. The superpower of the Bronze Age was no longer what it had been. In the following centuries, it would be doomed to internal conflict, foreign invasions, and fragmentation. Some victories are actually defeats. Now step back and look at the whole picture. Drought began. Grain declined. People were displaced. Migration started. The system shook. Trade was disrupted. Raw materials vanished, armies weakened, cities fell, and the collapse accelerated. But no one could see it, because everyone was inside the system. They were struggling with their own small crises. They had no distance to see the bigger picture, no time to understand it. And this is not where the story ends, because this is not just about the past. This is not just the story of the Bronze Age. This is the story of a universal disease of systems. Every great civilization builds a network. The larger and more connected that network becomes, the more powerful it appears. And it does create power. It creates efficiency. It creates prosperity. Trade grows, cities expand, arts flourish, writing spreads, knowledge accumulates. These are the signs of a civilization at its peak. But that same network also creates fragility, because every node, every connection point creates dependency. And the deeper the dependency, the more destructive a rupture becomes. The people of the Bronze Age built this network. It was magnificent, but they did not understand how fragile it was. Or perhaps they did not want to understand, because understanding would have required change, and change would have meant risking everything they had built. So no one changed anything. Everyone continued, until they couldn't anymore. Do you know what was left in the end? Tablets. Clay tablets that waited underground for hundreds of years. The final letters of Ugarit, the accounting records of Mycenae, the diplomatic correspondence of Hattusa. They survived the fire because clay becomes harder when burned. The irony is this: what destroyed them also preserved them. And when we read these tablets, what do we see? No grain, no help, no time. Even in the middle of the crisis, people kept writing. They kept communicating. They tried to survive. They tried to hold the system together. But the system had already slipped, and no one could hold it. Now, as you listen to this story, did you notice something? Interconnected economies, supply chains, climate change, migration waves, interdependent systems. Do these sound familiar? The Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE. Writing disappeared. Cities were abandoned. The memory of civilization was erased. They thought just like we do. The system was too big. It couldn't collapse. And that is exactly why it did.